especially winsome in this season. That comes through in the music so beautifully as a gift. Amen. I want to begin with a story that has intrigued me for a long time. Tangentially, it involves Joshua Bell, who is one amazing violinist. The Oregon Symphony has featured him repeatedly over the years, and he's best known for a recording of the music for the haunting movie, The Red Violin. You may have seen that. You may also know that he owns a Stradivarius violin, no surprise, but it's known as the Gibson Stradivarius, and it has a quite interesting and checkered history. It was made in 1713 in Cremona, Italy, and it had been owned by a violinist named Bronislaw Uberman, who's a remarkable old school violinist of the first half of the last century. Uberman, in fact, was performing a concert at Carnegie Hall in 1936, and he had decided to use his Guarneri violin for a program and left the Stradivarius, his main instrument, in his dressing room. And then it disappeared. No trace. After a few years, these things usually show up somewhere. But after a few years, Uberman gave up hope of finding the instrument and accepted a check for $30,000 from Lloyd's of London, which was a lot of money back then. And then nearly 50 years later, in 1985, an old man named Julius Altman was dying and in jail for something else. And he told his wife he had a terrible secret to confess, that violin he had been playing for decades, he had stolen a half century before from a dressing room in Carnegie Hall. He worked right next door in a restaurant called the Russian Bear, and had been playing that precious, fabulous instrument in smoky cafes, in fact, in the Washington, D.C. area ever since, playing it for people having anniversary suppers and birthdays and romantic rendezvous. And in that time, it had built up so much grime, it was nearly black. But the man could not take it anywhere to be properly cleaned and properly maintained, knowing that any violin maker would recognize it as a Stradivarius immediately and would wonder why someone of his modest talent and small means could own such an instrument. Well, his wife got a nice finder's fee when he died, and she let Lloyd's of London know where it was after her husband's death. But most interesting to me was the thief Julian Altman's upbringing. His mother had recognized early that he had musical talent, but she had trouble believing that someone that she had brought into the world would amount to very much in this life. It's an old story. As a young man, Julian Altman did what he needed to do to play professionally. He played for the National Symphony in Washington, D.C., in fact, as well as those smoky cafes. When quizzed about her husband's childhood after his death, Julian Altman's wife said that he told her that his mother's fondest wish for him was that one day he would grow up and steal a really good violin. Now, you can just write that off as, the mother from hell. But what I want to know is what conditions in this world lead people to come up with those kinds of dreams for themselves or their children? I don't know what that woman went through growing up, what nightmare she faced, or her mother faced, or her mother's father. I'm sure that dreaming of stealing an Italian masterpiece was somehow a very rational hope for her. Things in this world get so twisted, don't they? We all know, what terrorism looks like when we see airplanes collide with tall buildings, but there are all kinds of levels of terror and each changes forever a life, or a family's life, or a childhood. Well, thank heavens most children don't have stories like Julian Altman's to tell, but many of us carry with us wounds that, will never quite heal. Troubling things our parents said that they don't even remember. Here's one from a woman named Valerie who dreamed of being a professional singer. She says, I haven't had any kind of singing job, not even a piano bar job, for over a year. I've been working a temp job in an office to pay my rent. I don't know, maybe it's an impossible dream. The other night I was having dinner with my folks and we got into my problems and my father said, don't worry, you'll always be my little failure. I'm sure he didn't realize how much it hurt, but those words really tore me apart, she said. Dreams, hopes, not knowing quite what to hope for. I want to talk a little bit about that subject this morning because it's at the heart of that Old Testament scripture from the lectionary that's set for today. In that text, violence surrounds the city of Jerusalem. The enemy here is Babylon. We've heard a lot about them in other texts from the lectionary this last year. Their skill at striking terror into the hearts of their adversaries is legendary. How is one to live in such a time, asks the prophet Habakkuk. The threat of violence from outside is tremendous, but there is also a threat of violence within the walls of the city where they are taking refuge. There's a violence being carried out against widows and orphans within the city. There are endless litigations going on. And all this weighs so heavily on the prophet. He becomes weary to the bone. Why does this go on, he asks. Why would a good God allow these things to happen? Now, Habakkuk is not tempted to doubt the existence of God. Not for a minute. No, he retains a lively faith throughout his time of complaining. He simply cannot understand why God, who he believes has a supreme regard for the poor and the powerless especially, can let unspeakable things go on. Why doesn't God rise up and act, he wonders. Habakkuk is one of those who prays and prays for peace and sees nothing on the horizon but war. He's like one who prays and prays for healing at the bedside of a sick loved one, and yet death keeps sticking its ugly head into the room. Habakkuk's complaints to God are never made for the sake of complaining. He simply believes that his heart is like God's heart, as all the prophets do. A heart that's huge and vulnerable at the same time. So, like all the prophets of Israel and Judah, his purpose is to incite God to action with his prayer. He waits not resignedly, but with total resolution. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what God will say to me and what God will answer concerning my complaint. And then the Lord answered me and said, write this vision. Make it plain on stone tablets, not paper, so that and make it big, so that even a runner may read it, right? Put it on a billboard so someone who's sprinting by might see it, not a jogger. No, this is for someone who's running to his broker in order to cash everything in during a market freefall. Running like a man whose funeral I did 25 years ago, whose first action once he found out he had lung cancer was to take everything out of his bank account and go to Reno. Well, those are weak examples. No, the billboard-sized sign, in the end, is really for anyone running away from anything because he's tempted to believe that evil, not truth, will have the last word. Well, God tells the prophet to write this on tablets of stone, again, so they'll last. because it might have to last long enough to be read by those who will come after, generations hence. Those who will feel the same bone weariness that comes at the result of the accumulation of that kind of stress and suffering and worry. It's for people who are knocked down by a loved one's sickness or death, or people who will feel acutely the threat of some act of national violence, right? Like January 6th. It's a message for people who are sick and tired of bad news. It's for people whose first prayer when they take a look at the morning news is, "How long, O Lord?" How many wonderful people have to die of cancer before we're going to lick this thing, right? How many have to perish in these mass shootings that come now 3 or more a week? God, how many? How many children have to die this way before a critical mass of legislatures will show some spine and buck the pressure of the gun lobby and do something to turn back this constant wave of mayhem? Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vine, though the produce of the olive fails and the field yield no food, says Habakkuk, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there's no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. The words of the prophet take seriously the Apostle Paul's sense that God is not some great being on some lofty throne high in the stratosphere, but is in fact the God that Paul speaks of, in whom we live and move and have our being. You know, the Apostle Paul valued the wisdom of Habakkuk, the prophet we're talking about today, above everything in the Hebrew Testament. He faced so many difficulties, shipwrecks, illness, the rest. And yet, in one notable letter, he quotes Habakkuk. He says, "The just shall live by their faithfulness." By the most basic acts of daily faithfulness, no matter what's going on, no matter what we're worried about. How do you do that? How do you do that in 2022 or 2023, which will soon be here? Maybe by doing something as simple as choosing to vote, or to bring a child into the world, right? Why do that knowing the score as we do, knowing how hard this life can be, wondering as we do what kind of world our children and our grandchildren are going to inherit? Remember what season we're entering. Advent. The season when we remember that God so loved the world that God sent a special child to the earth when everyone who cared about justice for little children had just about given up hope. We're talking here about hope, but not pie-eyed hope. This is hope knowing the score. When I think of hope, I often think of the late president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat. Remember him? We don't talk about him much. But he flew to Israel in the late 1970s in hope of making a lasting peace with the greatest Israel, the great enemy of Egypt, Israel. And at that time, a woman named Golda Meir was prime minister in Israel. And they were interviewed together on television. And it was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. She playfully reminded him that he had once, years before, spoken to the press, referring to her as that mean old lady. And he blushed and was so embarrassed. And then she offered him a wrapped package, a present for his granddaughter, his first grandchild. A baby that had been born the morning he'd flown out of Egypt for Israel. He hadn't even seen her yet. Golda Meir said, "I have many grandchildren." And you could see Anwar Sadat's lower lip trembling as he received that gift from her hand. He had known the risk he had taken going to Israel. He knew he had very likely signed his death warrant, which in fact he had. But he also knew that he had to do it so his grandchildren would have hope for peace. Real hope. You know, real hope is always about our grandchildren, whether we have any or not. They're all our grandchildren, right? Here again, the words of the prophet. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vine, though the produce of the olive fails and yields no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there's no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. Acts of faithfulness. You know, sometimes we have little choice but to be faithful, right? Out of habit, if nothing else. The late Dr. Rob Proudfoot, a professor at my alma mater, the University of Oregon, traveled to Vietnam about 40 years ago. He spoke with many people, none so interesting as an ancient woman who was living with 5 generations of her family in their little village in the north near Hanoi. Proudfoot just said, tell me your story. It's simple, really, she said. In the 1930s, the Chinese came and they burned my little house, and we went off to the hills, and then we came back and we rebuilt it. Then in the 40s, the Japanese came and they burned my house, and we went to the hills, and then we came back and we rebuilt it again. Then in the 50s, the French came, and they burned my house. And we went to the hills, and then we came back, and we rebuilt it a third time. And then in the 60s, the Americans came, and they burned my house again. And we went to the hills. And then we came back. And we rebuilt it. When are we going to learn to live together? She said. Proudfoot asked her if she thought it would ever be possible, and she said, well, I keep rebuilding my house, so I guess that means I think it can happen. What a patient place, Vietnam. What a patient people. And look, now we all love pho, right? Even if we can't pronounce it. Vietnamese beef noodle soup. Most things take 8 times longer to happen than we expect. So goes the saying. In the meantime, what are we to do? The text today from Habakkuk says, stay at your post. Be vigilant, not a vigilante. Just be vigilant. Make plans and execute them. Be like the OSU Beavers yesterday. Down 3 freaking touchdowns in the 4th quarter. And yet one little 4-yard run at a time. Never a pass. Oh my God. Keep watch. Do the work your hand finds to do. Do your duty as you know it. And look for those moments when the hand of God is in fact breaking through. If you're a beaver, you know that. If you have eyes to see it, you will see justice aching to be born. You can see it in the results of the last election. Lots of wonderful, independent-minded American voters who love this country went to the polls from coast to coast, natural-born conservatives, and they cast their votes for integrity, refusing to vote for candidates who were pushing wacko conspiracy theories and big lies. The big wave happened in the middle. Those sensible folks who knew what they had to do, God bless them. They keep hope alive. They keep hope alive for us, our grandchildren, in big times, in big things and little things, in things global and those things right here close to home. And in this way, they are showing us how to live faithfully, as Habakkuk called us to do so long ago. Amen and amen.